Hey guys, in the coming lectures and in fact in this lecture also we'll start talking about functions and what are the changes that ES6 brought to functions. So the first thing that we will talk about is default parameters. But before we jump ahead of ourselves, let me tell you one thing. Functions are important part of any programming language, and prior to ES6, JavaScript functions hadn't changed much since the language was created. This left a lot of backlog of problems and nuanced behavior that made making mistakes easy and often required more code just to do some basic behaviors. And ES6 makes functions a big leap forward. Now, taking into account years of complaints, requests from JavaScript developers, the result is a number of incremental improvements on top of ES5 functions that make programming in JavaScript less error prone and more powerful. Let's quickly talk about functions and the default parameters that were introduced in ES6. Now, functions in JavaScript are unique in the way that they have a number of parameters to be passed regardless the number of parameters declared in the function definition. This allows you to define functions that can handle different number of parameters, often by just filling in default values when parameters aren't provided. Now in this video what we'll cover is what happens with the default arguments that ES6 brings to the table, along with some important information around argument object and using expressions as parameters. So simulating the default behavior on how ES5 code or probably earlier code would look like, I've created a small function that's nothing but a make request. It accepts three parameters: the URL, timeout, and the callback. And of course, the default value is not given or provided here because it was ES5 or before. So we use an OR condition. OR condition. So what happens is both timeout and callback are actually optional because they are given a default value if the parameter isn't provided. Now the logical OR operator that you see out here always returns the second operand when the first argument is falsy, which means if timeout or callback is not provided or probably is undefined, it will be false. In that case, it will give you 3000 or this empty function. Now the problem is when timeout has a value of 0 and 0 is also a sign of negativity, which means false. So in that case also, even if you pass the timeout as 0, this would become 3000. Of course, there are ways of overcoming it by using a type of, and let me show you how that can be done. So you will first check the type of. So let's say I will do a type of, and in this case I can check for timeout, and if it is not equal to undefined, only then, and let me make sure I put the quotes, not equal to undefined, in that case I can use the ternary operator and give it timeout. If it is, then I can give the 3000 value. Similarly, I can copy the same thing for callback. So instead of callback, I can just do callback and check if it's undefined, and in the other case it will do this. So you can definitely fix this by adding type of to your functions. It is very easy. While this approach is safer, it also requires a lot of extra code that you need for a very basic operation, which is a default value. Now popular JavaScript libraries are filled with similar patterns, as this presents a common pattern. ES6 makes it easier to provide default values for parameters by providing initializations that are used when the parameter isn't formally passed. Let me give you an example. So the same example, let me copy this and comment this out so that we have it here. Now here I can give a timeout is equals to 3000. Similarly, callback I can say is equal to function, which is an empty or an anonymous function. And that's it. Bang, done. That's all I need to do. This function only expects the first parameter to be always passed. The other two parameters have default values, which makes the body of the function much smaller because you don't have to pass in the code or check the missing parameter or missing value and take an action accordingly. Now let's make sure how the calls will work. So let me give you an example how this call can work. So the first thing, you can do a make request. Now when you do a make request, you can pass the parameter. Let's say you can say foo bar, so /foo. The moment you do a foo bar or a foo call, in this case timeout and callback are not given. In that scenario, it will take the default value. Now if I do the same thing and I pass one of the parameters, let's say this comma timeout of 1000, in that scenario it will take the timeout as 1000 and the callback will still be default. Similarly, if I do all the three parameters, it will accept all the three parameters. Sorry, 1000, and this can be a function. Of course, you can do anything that you want to do in this function, and this function can also be passed. You can pass in a body and act on that body accordingly. So ES6 considers URL to be required, which means in this scenario, this is a required. If you don't pass it, it will not be working, which is why this is passed in all the three calls. You can see all the three calls. And you also see a pattern here. So whatever are the required parameters, you usually keep them ahead so that the optional parameters are at the back, because then it doesn't get confused. However, it is possible to specify default values for any arguments, including those that appear before the arguments, without default values in the function declaration. Let me show you an example. So in this scenario, I can just remove callback to be a default function. Let's say I do that and I just keep it as a callback. Now the rest of the function behaves the same way. So in this scenario, the default value of timeout is 3000. You can see out here, will be used if the second argument passed in as a null or an undefined, not a null but an undefined actually. So if I make the call instead of 1000, I do an undefined. In this scenario, the default value of 3000 will take its precedence. And of course, if I need to pass a third parameter, this by default has to be an undefined, otherwise it will not work. Now, in case of default parameter values, a value of null is considered to be a valid value, which means that the third call to make request, which is out here, if I pass a null, this will be used as a valid value and it will not be taken as a default value. So we need to be very careful when you're using parameters and default values and you pass in a null, because that assumes that that's an actual value and it's not set to the default of 3000. So whenever you need a default, you may want to do an undefined. Now let's quickly check another thing, is how the default values impact the arguments object altogether. Now just keep in mind that the behavior of the arguments object is different when the default parameters are present. In ES5, which is in the non-strict mode, the argument object reflects the changes in the named parameters of a function. Now that was all about the English. Let me show you how it is in the code. Let's see if you have an example where we have a function of mixed arguments. I have a first argument and a second argument. When I check the functions and the argument, which is argument 0 and 1, everything is the same. Similarly, when I reassign to C and D and I compare it with arguments, the arguments also should get updated ideally. So let's make a call to mix arguments now, and let's pass the values of A, comma B, and let's see what happens. And the console should give me all true, which means even after updating the values to C and D, the arguments also got updated. So it is safe to say that the arguments object is always updated in the non-strict mode to reflect changes in the named parameters. Thus, when the first and the second are assigned, which is out here C and D, when we assign a value to it, which assigned to the arguments 0 and 1, and are updated accordingly, making all the triple equals, which is this as well as this triple equals, to be a true. Now in ES5, which is in the strict mode, let's say if you use instead of in the function itself, where you give something called as a, let me put it in the quotes, use strict and colon. In this scenario, when you try to do, the last two arguments will become false, which means in the strict mode, the arguments object do not reflect changes to the named parameters. The arguments object in the functions using ES6 default parameter values, however, will always behave in the same manner as ES5 with the strict mode. So regardless of whether the function is explicitly running in the strict mode or not, the presence of the default parameter value triggers the arguments object to remain detached from the named parameters. This is a little subtle but important detail because of how the arguments object may be used. So let's say even in ES6, which is even in the non-strict mode, so let's comment this out. Now we have ES6 on the browser. Let's just do a console.log and let's say arguments.length. What this will do is this will give me how many arguments are present, and the answer is of course 2. I haven't changed anything yet, but the argument size is 2. And after that is run and I call mix array of A, now let's see what happens. You can see that this becomes a 1, which means the size is 1. Now that we have one parameter passed, let's make sure we assign a default value of B to the second argument. Now you can see that the argument list or the length is 1. It was 1 when you called A as well, but even with the default argument it is 1. And then of course the first argument is true because there is a value to it. The second one is a false because second is B and argument 1 is actually an undefined. And similarly, when you assign it C and D, and so we can say that changing the arguments first and second to C and D has no effects on the arguments object, because now both of them are false and false.